Hello and welcome to another episode of Scream Theory. In this video, I want to share some advice for people who are in their intermediate to advanced stages in learning false chord vocals. And based on what I've seen, it takes about 5 to 6 months of regular practice for a person to be in their intermediate stage, and about a year before a person is really in that advanced stage. Intermediate level false chord vocalists are very comfortable with using their false chords in their mid-range. Their false chords are starting to vibrate faster and consistently enough for it to sound pretty decent. An advanced level false chord vocalist is even more comfortable with using their false chords, not just in their mid-range, but they've started to figure out how to lower the pitch and raise the pitch. So in this video, I want to talk about doing low-pitched and high-pitched false chord screams. I want to talk about stamina so that you can learn to scream for minutes on end without running out of breath or getting tired, and pronunciation. Now we're going to start with raising the pitch. So if you can do kind of a mid-ranged false chord scream, then you probably feel all the rumbly vibrations happening kind of right around here in your throat. Definitely feels like it's happening higher up in the throat than where the false chords are actually located. And when you do a high-pitched scream, it's the same feeling. It might even shift up a little bit more, but you really want to open the mouth wide. And the reason why we feel it up here, even though the false chords are located down here, is because up here is just kind of where it feels like all the sound waves and the air is colliding. And it kind of feels like all the sound waves are just coming up and reflecting off of the superior portion of the back of your throat and just kind of bouncing outward, almost projecting or amplifying outward, kind of like how an acoustic guitar works. And so a mid-ranged and a high-pitched false chord scream feel very similar, but the difference is with a high-pitched false chord scream, you must really have to open the mouth more and feel it higher up. And when you first start reaching for your high-pitched false chord screams, it's probably going to sound very dry and airy, and it's not going to have a lot of tone to it. It may still sound more similar to your mid-ranged, but you have to understand that the false chords have to vibrate very, very fast to produce those high-pitched tones. And with false chord screaming, all we're doing is stimulating the false chords with movement to slowly but gradually learn to vibrate faster and faster. So when you first attempt your high-pitched false chord screams, it's gonna sound kind of like this. So I'm gonna do a high-pitched false chord scream, and I'm gonna start with very little air. So now for low-pitched false chord screams. Low-pitched false chord screams aren't necessarily about getting the false chords to vibrate any faster than they are if you're producing a decent mid-ranged false chord scream, but it's more of a positioning and coordination thing. I'm going to lightly vibrate my false chords, and I'm going to descend into my low pitch. And you can hear this transition. You can hear this shift in how my false chords are being positioned to produce that lower pitched tone. And to make that transition happen, all I'm doing is scrunching my tongue up posteriorly into my throat. It can help to curl your tongue back like this, but just remember that the action isn't in the front of the tongue, it's dropping the tongue back, really scrunching it up deep into your throat. And it also feels like everything above my larynx is narrowing, so I'm really narrowing my throat positioning to form a tube and really funneling the sound outward through this tube and pursing my lips. And it really helps to practice to other people doing those low-pitched, guttural-sounding false chord vocals. This is an element of false chord screaming that is just purely about coordination. Once you can get your false chords rumbling fast enough to produce a decent tone in your mid-range, then really just lowering the pitch is figuring out the right positioning. And it definitely feels like low-pitched false chord screams are happening very deep in your throat, like right at the level of where the false chords are actually located. And for those really guttural, gurgly sounding ones, they almost feel like they're happening like right here, like almost in the front of my neck. Like that's really where I'm feeling all of the vibrations. So moving on to pronunciation and diction. Pronunciation is so important. It's what I consider the difference between someone who is good at false chord screaming and someone who is amazing at false chord screaming. It's the tiniest details in every single word you say that really allows you to craft a unique and recognizable sounding voice. It also allows your screams to sound more dynamic, and let me show you what I mean by this. I'm going to scream the vowels 2 different times, and I want you to listen and just consider which one sounds better.
A, I, O, U. A, E, I, O, U.
While they both sounded good, the second example sounded better. You could really hear each individual vowel that I was saying. In the first example, the A and the E sounded almost exactly the same. The I wasn't that much distinguishable from the E. The difference between those two was I was really exaggerating each vowel sound in the second example, and I was changing the positioning of my mouth to actually help me pronounce those different vowel sounds. But for people who are in their earlier stages of learning false chord vocals, what happens is we have a tendency to just stick with one kind of throat and mouth shape. In whatever position we figure out that's most comfortable for getting our false chords vibrating, we kind of tend to stay in that position, and we almost change our pronunciation to match how we position our mouth and our throat. When what we need to do is change how we position our mouth and throat to match the words we're trying to say. So when I said the A, I have a very open mouth posture, but when I said E, my mouth is now very wide. And when I said the U, I was pronouncing it like ooh, ooh, and now I have that more narrow, tube-shaped mouth posture. And it can be very difficult to make our false chords vibrate while changing the positioning of our mouth and even our throat. And so people who are in their intermediate stage of false chord screaming tend to just kind of pronounce every single word with the same mouth posture and throat posture. It just kind of makes everything sound very monotone, like they're just doing the same thing over and over again. And what you really want is to practice your vowel sounds and just really practice on exaggerating every single vowel and syllable that you say so that you can make your scream sound more dynamic. To give you another example of this, we're going to use Ben Durr of Shadow of Intent. I know I bring him up a lot, but he's just such a talented false chord vocalist. And the reason for that is listen to how dynamic his screams sound, especially his low-pitched screams. He's really focusing on how he pronounces every single syllable, and he's consciously focusing on it. It really makes his voice sound unique. Like, a lot of false chord vocalists can sound very similar to each other because really they're producing the same distorted overtones, but the main difference that separates someone from another is how they pronounce their words. So I'm going to scream some Shadow of Intent lyrics, and the first example is going to be me using not so good pronunciation, and the second example, I'm going to really focus on and exaggerate each individual syllable.
Is this the beginning and the end? Your fate's in the palm of my hand. Is this the beginning or the end? Your fate's in the palm of my hand. My judgment is clouded by madness of the mind. A silence I never deserved, but rather you am past. My judgment is clouded by madness of the mind. A silence I never deserved, but rather you am past. From the abyss of eternal loneliness to the nostalgic rush of memory, If only I possessed the flame in which I was born. From the abyss of bitter loneliness to the nostalgic rush of memory. If only I possessed the flame in which I was born. In a series of found gentle references along the front, it took us to the labyrinth of enemies to die abysmal death. In a series of found gentle references along the front, it took us to the labyrinth of enemies to die abysmal death. She's in my ears. She's in my mouth. She's in my mind. She's in my ears. She's in my mouth. She's in my mind.
So hopefully you were able to hear how just by pronouncing my words better, I was able to add a lot more character to my voice, and it sounded so much more dynamic instead of me just kind of shouting the same thing over and over again and being really monotoned. And so when you practice to other vocalists, if you're trying to cover a song, listen very closely to how they pronounce each word and how they might embellish each individual syllable. Just those fine little details that add so much. So maybe you find a syllable or a word that you're having a hard time keeping your false chords vibrating while you perform that mouth shape that allows you to really exaggerate the pronunciation. Whenever you find something like that, just go out of your way to really practice just that one word over and over again. Like if I'm practicing a song I'm trying to cover and I find that there's like even just a phrase or a word that I'm having a hard time with, I'll just literally practice that word like 100 times until I really nail it, and then I'm good to go. And so you don't really have to go out of your way to practice like pronunciation exercises, but just by practicing to other people, trying to cover songs, and finding your weaknesses, the syllables or words that you might have a hard time pronouncing, tackling those one by one over time, you'll have really good pronunciation, but you just got to focus on it, be aware of it, and just not do the same thing over and over again. Another factor in pronunciation is diction, which is more about the movements of our lips, our tongue, and our teeth. Sometimes it feels like I'm just kind of generating a vector of sound that's just shooting out of my mouth, and my lips and teeth and tongue are just shaping that into words. Kind of like a spider weaving a web. So when you gotta pronounce words quickly, or even when you're pronouncing words slowly, just focus on those rapid, concise movements of your mouth, your jaw, and your lips. So now let's talk about stamina and endurance. How is it that some people are able to scream like 100 words a minute for minutes on end and not get tired or run out of breath? Well, let me tell you a little story. For the first few years that I was practicing false chord screaming, I actually built up a lot of bad technique. I wanted it to sound as impressive and as powerful and brutal as possible. And over time, I started to realize, hey, if I push a ton of air, I can make it sound really powerful and impressive and have a lot of energy. And it sounded really good when I just really full-forced every scream, so I thought that that's what people were doing. I thought that because I sounded really good, I must be doing it right. And so over the next 2.5 years that I practiced this way, that I was full forcing every single scream, I actually became dependent on putting that much air into every single scream. It was like I built up the coordination in such a way that was dependent on that much air. Like I was anticipating having to put that much power. And as a result, like anything less just did not sound good. I couldn't get my false chords to vibrate in a way that sounded good with less air. And so it wasn't until it dawned on me that, maybe I just really need to practice at lower intensity for a long period of time, and then it will sound good. So that's what I did. I spent the next 3 to 4 months just really trying to figure out how to give less air, yet still get like a thick and rich sound out of my false chords, but at a significantly lower volume. When I do push too much air, this is what happens. My abs get sore because I'm really contracting my abs to have to push so much air, and my throat, the muscles in my larynx, all those little tiny intrinsic laryngeal muscles, they actually kind of get really tight and they kind of lock up. And as a result, I might full power false chord scream for like 30 seconds and then the technique just falls apart. Like my false chords themselves physically stop vibrating and it's impossible to maintain. I have to take like a 10 to to 15-second break. I might have to swallow, get a breather, and then I can keep going. But just full power false chord screaming for longer than 30 seconds for me is just not possible. And the reason why I think my false chords would kind of lock up and all those muscles in my larynx would get tight is because they were having to contract so hard to stabilize my false chords and to stabilize my larynx against all that air that I'm forcing through the tube. So if you have any of these issues, maybe your abs get really tight or your false chords themselves feel like they just kind of lock up on you and refuse to continue to vibrate, and you have to kind of take a 10-second break, maybe longer, before they'll continue to vibrate, or maybe you're just kind of getting lightheaded, you keep running out of breath, well, you're probably pushing way more air than you need. So instead, I try to scream at about 60 to 70% of what I would consider full power for myself. And I also focus on really trying to relax all the muscles in my larynx so they don't get tight and lock up on me and make my technique just fall apart. Screaming at full power definitely sounds way better than screaming at half power, but if I can't make it through a full song, then there's no point. So instead, save your full power moments for maybe an individual word or a breakdown or maybe just a single sentence that you're trying to add extra force to. Try to find a level of effort that is comfortable, that still sounds good enough, and focus on trying to make it sound better, trying to generate more distortion, make your false chords produce a sound that is more toned and more rich, but not necessarily louder. So that's about it for this video. If you like the way I explain metal vocals and you want to support the channel, well, please give a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. I will see you guys in the next one.